I'm Sophie, and this is Book Reviews by Sophie. Today we will be reviewing Misery by Stephen King. The genre is horror, and it is set in Colorado. Misery was published in 1987, making it the oldest book I've reviewed to date. This book centers on famous author Paul Sheldon and the aftermath of what should have been a fatal car crash in a snowstorm. However, Paul lives, thanks to former nurse Annie Wilkes, who just happens to find Paul at the crash site. Annie also turns out to be a big fan of Paul's series, Misery. It quickly becomes clear that Annie is not only his savior, but also his captor, keeping the physically incapacitated Paul locked in her house, with no intentions of letting him leave, ever. If that wasn't enough, she also demands Paul write her own special book in the Misery series, as she doesn't like the ending of the last one. She has ways of making him do what she wants, from denying him food to hurting him physically. So he needs to be very calculating in his attempt to escape. Paul is working against the clock to write this last book, which could be his ticket to freedom, or could mean certain death, as he is in the hands of the unstable Annie. Now let's talk about my thoughts. This book earned a 4 out of 5 stars for me, and is definitely a solid horror read. This was my introduction to Stephen King, and he certainly didn't disappoint. I think one reason this book worked so well for me was that Annie was a very unpredictable character. I never knew what was going to set her off and what she would do next. This in turn made the book very twisty and full of unexpected events. I really dislike when a book is predictable and I can see things coming a mile away, but I never had to worry about that in Misery. It was also really interesting to see the story play out from the perspective of Paul. Though he is a famous author, he's also just like any one of us. And in that way, it's like I could almost imagine myself in his shoes. It was also really fascinating to watch Paul learn how to talk to Annie, how to manipulate her in order to survive, as this is what any of us would have to go through if we were the prisoner instead of Paul. This book definitely has the most tense scenes that I have read in any recent thriller or horror book. Without spoiling anything, there were several scenes where Paul was racing against the clock and his very survival hung in the balance. I was holding my breath the whole time, sitting on the edge of my seat to see what would happen next. The only reason this book didn't get 5 stars for me is because of the portions where we're reading the book Paul is writing. That part of the book didn't really grab me and felt extremely long and frankly a little boring. Now let's move on to the thematic elements in Misery. One big theme throughout the book is control. Annie craves control, leading her to exercise that control over Paul through what he eats, how he manages his pain, what he does, etc., especially in how she keeps him trapped in her home. At the same time, Paul utterly lacks control. He is the one that is trapped and has many of his personal controls stripped away from him by Annie. Another theme that goes hand in hand with control is power. In the beginning, Annie holds all of the power over Paul. Paul is locked up, and as I've illustrated, she holds the key to all the things he could need. Food, medication, all that kind of stuff. Even to his survival and his escape. As the reader moves through the novel, we see Paul learn to take power over Annie where he can. Annie wishes to be in control and believes that this is in everyone's best interest, which is illustrated by a quote on page 173, where Annie is discussing a rat caught in a trap, how its heart beats, how it struggles to get away. As we do, Paul, as we do. We think we know so much, but we really don't know any more than a rat in the trap. A rat with a broken back that thinks it still wants to live. Now let's talk about my recommendation for this book. I would recommend this book to anyone wanting to get into Stephen King. It's not very long, and it's not super over-the-top horrific, so it's a good starter point, I think. Don't get me wrong, it definitely has its moments of horror for sure, but definitely touches more on the psychological horror and thriller aspects. I would also make sure to look up trigger warnings, as there are some pretty intense concepts in the book, but besides that, I think most people that enjoy the horror and thriller genre would really love reading this book. That's everything for today's video. Thank you so much for watching this review on Misery by Stephen King, and stay posted for more book reviews by Sophie. Bye!